Awesome. Thank you. So we can get started with last session of the day. I hope you all had a great, I guess you enjoyed the proceedings today. And this last session, I'm going to invite my co-moderator, Cecile, so we can start. And I would also like to invite our panelists. And the topic of the discussion in this particular session is global perspectives for pediatric drug development. And I'm actually honored to invite the panelists on the stage, and those are Ralph Bax, EMA, Mona Khurana from FDA CDER, Agnes Klein, I believe Agnes is online on Zoom, Perdita Taylor-Zapata from NICHD, and finally Sarah Zaidi from FDA Office of Pediatric Therapeutics.
Yeah.
Go ahead, introduce yourself.
Yes. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Kanwaljit, for having me co-hosting with you. I'm really thrilled to be here and enjoying the discussion about pediatrics. By training, I'm an engineer in clinical research and development, and I've been with CPAS for 2.5 years as managing director for the European office. And prior to that, I was at the European Medicine Agency in the pediatric team with Ralph here from the early days of the implementation of the pediatric regulation. And it's really exciting time to hear the discussion. I was also an expert in the ICH E11 revision where we pick it up from Steven Spielberg. So I think you did a good job because we didn't change much. We just added new. So new knowledge. So thank you very much. And maybe for those speakers who haven't had the opportunity to speak yet, if you could please introduce yourself to the audience. Thank you.
I think Dr. Khurana, do you want to?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Mona Khurana. I am a pediatric nephrologist by training. I've been at FDA for about 14 years. And for the last 7 years in my current role as team leader in the Division of Pediatrics and Maternal Health. My division is housed in the Office of New Drugs in CDER at FDA.
Great.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah Zaidi, similar to Anita Zaidi, and I was just waiting for someone to also mess up my last name because people love to change the last I into an A. I don't know why. I'm a pediatric pulmonologist by training. I joined FDA about 5, 6, 7 years ago. It's all blurring together already in the Office of New Drugs as a pulmonology reviewer. And now I'm in the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, and I'm here in this regard. I chair the pediatric cluster in the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, and very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And it's great to see all my fellow panelists. I didn't get a chance to say hello to you, Perdita.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think for the sake of completeness, maybe I'll invite Ralph to provide a reintroduction to, even though I think he did it before when we spoke with him this morning.
Reintroduce yourself.
Can you introduce yourself? Sorry.
Everyone.
So my name is still Ralph Bax. I hope I still work at the European Medicines Agency because they sent me over, and since then I haven't heard anything from them. And as I said, I did get some news that actually also a multi-stakeholder meeting is going on, and it's going very well. So I am actually a pediatrician neonatologist by training. I just looked at LinkedIn, and that says I have been 16 years and 5 months in clinical in the hospital and research arena, and then about the same time again at the European Medicines Agency. So my CV is rather boring. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Perdita, do you want to go?
Sure. Perdita Taylor-Zapata again. I'm actually from the obstetric and pediatric pharmacology branch of NICHD, so one branch within the Child Health Institute. But I did reach out to a few of my colleagues at NICHD to get some additional information for other networks that are involved in real world data, so I can share a little bit of that as well. I've been at NICHD since 2004, and as I said before, oversee the pediatric drug development program at the NICHD, the BPCA clinical program, and I'm a general pediatrician by training.
Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe we have Agnes online as well. Agnes, can you hear us and can you speak?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, because I've been having a little bit of problem with an unstable network. Good afternoon. Thank you again for the invitation. My name is Agnes Klein. I'm a physician by training, and I'm a public health physician by training again. I have done residencies in endocrinology, metabolism, and medical biochemistry. For a variety of reasons, I ended up after doing some practice and doing a little bit of public health, I ended up in the federal government as on a temporary basis, and here I am 40 years later. However, that has allowed me to have a broad understanding of regulations, and I tend to call myself a jack of all trades and a master of none. With that, I can tell you that I've seen all the developments and all the encouraging developments in terms of harmonization and collaboration internationally that have resulted in the past years. Thank you.
Thanks, Agnes.
Thank you. And yes, and maybe as a way to recap some of the discussion we had today and introduce our panel as to why do we have a panel that focuses on global regulatory activities, it's important to remember, as discussed today, that despite regulatory legislative actions in Europe and US, children are still therapeutic orphans in many areas, and there are many children treated off-label, particularly if we go down to neonates, where the off-label use is still quite important, and this has resulted in the past in several catastrophes. And the role of regulators is truly and their duty to ensure that medicines for use in children are of high quality, ethically researched and authorized appropriately. And to do so, there is truly the need to have assessments based on clinically robust and relevant data, which is something that is lacking in pediatrics for many reasons. There are still local differences at the level of regulatory requirements. We discussed PIP, PSPs, and other. Agnes can also comment later on regulatory activities in Canada, but the other countries like Switzerland are starting to have their own regulatory pediatric activities, operational practicalities and standard of care that vary, and that is affecting the way to conduct multi-regional pediatric development. So there is really the need to have global studies to truly overcome some of these challenges by addressing feasibility related to small number of patients in many areas, allocate resources to areas where studies are most needed, and have better utilization of scattered clinical expertise across territories, and really have everybody working together to advance the understanding of some of the disease and accelerate the development of new therapies. And as mentioned, generate robust and relevant data in a timely manner. I think that was also mentioned in the panel earlier. The 9 years time difference between adult authorization and pediatric authorization is truly creating great challenges to the conduct of clinical trial, having competition between off-label use and clinical trial. And there are several ways to overcome some of these hurdles. Some are by the development and use of pediatric research coordinating centers, and we have IACT and C4C in the room today, representing clinical trial network in Europe and in the US. Another way is collaboration for collaborative studies, and data sharing is also very important, and CPAS is really advancing the topic. And one other possibility to truly overcome some of the hurdles is common scientific approach and regulatory alignments through mechanisms like ICH and collaboration amongst regulators. So to kick off the panel, I would like to invite our panelists to comment on a question on how do regulatory bodies align or try to align and discuss compatibility for pediatric development, and are there any priorities? So I wonder if anybody would like to go first with that question.
like to go first? Okay, thank you. I guess I'll take that question as the scientific and physician liaison of the pediatric cluster. Of course, I can't speak for the whole of FDA, and when you talk about priorities, there's different priorities that apply to so many different areas. But what I would say is that from my experience and my understanding, there's a great sense of importance of aligning for pediatric drug development within FDA and within at the forum of the pediatric cluster. How we operationalize that is by, first of all, having the cluster and having discussions where the goal of the discussions is to facilitate transparency, have data sharing, be open, and have regulatory concerns that we can discuss, ethical concerns, scientific concerns that we can discuss with other regulators. And the goal is to reduce the need for duplicative trials or trials that have elements that may not, they could be trimmed down. They may not need to be performed. Maybe less children could be enrolled. Maybe less trials could be performed. And so I think the very existence of the pediatric cluster kind of shows the priority of that the FDA places on having global regulatory consultation, and also all the other members, of course, of the pediatric cluster, without which we couldn't function. So that's EMA, Therapeutic Goods of Australia, I might be messing up the name, Health Canada, PMDA in Japan, and without all of these agencies having this kind of a commitment for resources and time, we wouldn't be able to be here. So that's a very simple sort of preliminary comment that I will make.
Thank you. Ralph, is there anything you want to add to that from the EMA perspective?
Yes, I think, as I mentioned today already, these cluster interactions are, or the relevance and importance are, at least from our side, increasing. So as you might know, we have also a pediatric committee, so we need to integrate expertise from across the European regulatory network to contribute then to these discussions. Priority-wise, I mean, we have been looking after 10 years of European medicines regulation or pediatric legislation, and have seen great advances, including that actually pediatric development is much more integrated into normal drug development. But there have been also some further room of improvements and challenges they pointed out, and this is specifically in oncology and neonatology. So here is for sure, this is for sure one of our priorities, but of course not neglecting the other areas which we have been discussing today. I just would like to emphasize that to have a global discussion, I think I also mentioned this morning, we might need to consider an offer to other regulatory agencies, because this is a discussion only between regulatory bodies to join. And then also what we all do is to support WHO in its aim to also support other regions such as in Africa. And there was a meeting of the PRN, the Pediatric Regulatory Network, not so long ago in Nairobi. And it was interesting to hear colleagues who also said, actually, we need to develop also a legislation in the space of pediatric drug development. That was just interesting to hear. And obviously, all colleagues are available to support in this respect.
Great. Thanks so much, Ralph. I think I'm also going to pose this question to Agnes, though, since she's online. Agnes, do you want to talk about?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, Kanwaljit. I just want to sort of start off by saying that the issue of developing pediatric legislation has been on the table for ever since I have been in the agency. And really the head of the pediatrics, a couple of pediatrics departments at the time approached us and said, look, the children are pediatric orphans. And there were a number of issues surrounding that at the time. There was no kind of push or process to have a legislation enacted at the time. And we had an ethics guidance from what was then the Medical Research Council, which no longer exists because in its place we have a Canadian Institute for Health Research with different institutes, which includes a maternal and pediatric health institute as well now. And there was a clear sentence that says you cannot conduct clinical trials. It's unethical to conduct clinical trials in children. So we had a very intense push on the part of the neonatology community in particular at that time, because they felt that they were left adrift, both legally and regulatory-wise, and of course science and drug development and dosage development-wise, and they were left to do each patient they felt that they were treating was a clinical trial of an N of 1, and that was just unacceptable because they couldn't even accumulate the data. Anyway, things went along and we had several meetings, and eventually in the last few years, there have been representation from the pediatric community that they really wanted and needed to conduct clinical trials. That said, we have benefited really by some drug development in other countries or internationally, and some clinical trials were coming into Canada, but in insufficient amount, and in a way that that our regulatory colleagues were not able to acquire an experience that would allow them to think what in Canada they were fond of saying at the time, outside of the box. In other words, some innovative thinking that you could come up with. Well, the time has come and we are working very assiduously. And I think a lot of that has got to do with, I think, these clusters, the international communication, and the increasing comfort that those who need to have the input into regulations and new processes in pediatrics can start thinking in different ways and start thinking in innovative ways. And we do have some gaps to fill, and maybe if we get another round, I can address how we are going to, or how we fill the gaps that we have identified, and how we came to identify the gaps.
Thank you, Agnes. Just continuing on the topic of global alignment, harmonization, but on a slightly different track. One question I wanted to ask Annie and all of you was this topic of a parallel review. I know this is something that has been at times encouraged, but I really wanted to have this discussion with all of our global regulatory colleagues who are present here today. What are your opinions in terms of advantages, perhaps any disadvantages or challenges in as it pertains to the concept of parallel review between EMA, FDA, Health Canada, if at all this happens, and how common in your experience this is? Is this something that has been encouraged? What is basically the current status of that?
Can I I'd like to start off that one, because we do have an old history of parallel reviews. During the time of when the HIV epidemic occurred, there were quite a few parallel reviews between Health Canada and the FDA at the time. And that was very valuable because I think there was an understanding of where the real risk, or a better understanding where the real risks and the mitigations could happen with the toxicity of the early HIV drugs. And there is another instance in which I was involved, and it was also a valuable one because it allowed us to accelerate the approval of that drug, which was when first Taxol came into being. And at the time I was the team leader of the oncology group, and that's how we ended up by approving it within, I think, about 5 months or less time, both in Canada and in the US. And we sort of had regular discussions. We did each our own review. We did our regular discussions. The decision in the end was a little bit different because we viewed the benefit risk in a different way than the way the FDA had determined it. But in fact, the substantive direction of the data was the same. We just settled on a slightly different dosage than what the FDA had settled in. In fact, we settled on a higher dosage, as was advised by our oncologists in-house at the time. They felt that the additional risk with the slightly higher dosage would result in a benefit that was a quantum above that with a slightly lower dosage that would decrease any of the risks. At the time, I think we did not have legal authority to demand certain things, and we actually, in the last about 5 years ago, have acquired that authority, which was another process in itself, but it allows us now to mitigate risks in many other ways. And that is very good because it allows some, what I would call intelligent risk-taking, in the sense that it allows us to adjust the clinical trials, the design, and even the endpoints to the particular disease and the appropriate way in which you can collect internationally clinical data and conduct a clinical trial that is multi-center and multinational.
Thank you. Yes, I think we will move to the view of the EMA and FDA as well in terms of parallel review on are there any, or maybe Sarah, there have been a paper published recently also from the impact of EMA, FDA parallel scientific advice, and whatever you can comment on any advantages and or challenges. We hear also it's not easy to go for parallel scientific advice, and yeah, so either you or Ralph, if you want. Thank you.
I can start if that's okay. I agree that based on my knowledge and experience, I think there isn't like a true parallel review process, but we have this process called parallel scientific review, which is actually carried out not from my office, but the Office of Global Policy and Strategy, and with EMA's international office. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then there's also something called Project Orbis, which is housed in the oncology office, where if I'm getting it right, you can Google all of this, which is what I did to prepare for this panel. There really is like, you think it's inside information, right? And I think that Health Canada and TGA, maybe, if I'm getting it right, worked with FDA to have parallel review in the oncology space, oncology only. And
I think it's Singapore and UK as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it may be updated. So, and then so that is something that, that's just for cancer drugs. If that's of something that's interest to you, relevant to you, can look that up. I'll talk a little bit now about the parallel scientific advice. That's something that occurs between FDA and EMA. And again, there's resources that you can find that are publicly available. There was a fairly recent, is there something wrong with my mic? Okay, thanks. There was a fairly recent webinar, the Small Business Industries, SBIA, something like that webinar, where Annabella Markel, Sandy Queter, Shannon Thor, and some other colleagues on the the parallel scientific advice. And so what happens is that a sponsor can initiate this request, and you, if you're the sponsor, you're going to approach FDA and you're going to approach EMA, and you're going to say, hey, I have something I want to talk about in terms of development, and we want to get FDA and EMA on the same page and go through this thought process together. I think EMA's international office reaches out to their experts. The Office of Global Policy and Strategy reaches out to the relevant FDA experts, and there's a series of meetings that occur. There are some meetings that occur, of course, FDA and EMA will undergo their internal review times as per usual. And then there's regulators that meet with each other. So FDA, EMA, which is currently the only two regulators that have this process, will meet with each other. And then there'll be a trilateral meeting with the sponsor, FDA and EMA. And what you get out of this process, will look like whatever, official formal regulatory advice you would get out of, say, a, type C meeting with FDA or something, just to pull an example. And EMA will also issue its own scientific advice or regulatory advice document, just as it would if there was no PSA being pursued. And it's a process by which you can hash out, issues that could get you to a place where you could have a better aligned development program. And I think, having talked to Sandy and Shannon and looked into this idea of the parallel scientific advice, yes, it is a more formal process. And so it takes time, but it actually doesn't I think there's a perception in industry that it's very difficult to obtain parallel scientific advice, or that it takes a long time. I think that if EMA and FDA agree that it's appropriate to, to take that path, it seems to, based on the information that OGPS has shared with us, it seems to be a fairly expeditious process, maybe even a little bit shorter than some of the usual meetings that occur through your interactions with your review divisions in CEDAR, for example. So that's a little bit of an overview. I don't know if Ralph has anything to say about it, or if there's any follow-up questions, I'm happy to take them.
I just wanted to clarify. I mean, there is no reliance process between FDA and EMA at the stage of evaluation for marketing authorization. However, what I find for the pediatric space even more important is to get it right early on, and then, in the end, if there is agreement and if we can all push for such an aligned development, then at a later stage, we might not need this. So on a European level, I mean, we have experience with integrating many countries and regulatory agencies, and I mean, we do have to recognize that this is already in Europe quite a logistical exercise. But for pediatrics, I mean, Sarah has mentioned the cluster, and if we agree, we can also have common commentaries. And I just wanted to point out that by having developed this collaboration over years, when it then came to COVID, we could just pick up the phone, and it was at the time Susie at the other end, and then we could, just agree, let's come up with a publication on how to fast track and on what to focus in PIP and PSP. Just pointing out, I mean, the templates might be different, but what we require, what we want to know, is just at different places and more or less the same. So I believe this is this also the trust developed and knowing each other is very important.
Thank you, Ralph and Sarah. So maybe now that we have warmed up on the regulatory landscape, we can dive a bit more into technical aspects, and maybe extrapolation is the next topic. And I wonder, Perdita, from your experience from the NICHD, so extrapolation is an approach that requires to have to be supported by data. And I wonder if at NICHD level, there is some work that is happening that can support this type of innovative approach in the drug development for children. Thank you.
So thank you for the question. If you don't mind, can I just give a response, like a more on-the-ground technical response to the previous question about?
Yes, please.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely.
No, it's totally fine because we don't do new drug development, so we don't do the discussions about with the EMA, FDA, et cetera. What I did want to talk about was more so about the practical on-the-ground's role of trying to do global studies. And what I wanted to mention was that in trying to implement these studies, once the agreement has been made that these studies can be done, and when you're trying to implement them, the challenge at the implementation level includes things such as trying to get the IRB in a particular, whether it's Canada or Botswana, et cetera, trying to go through the process of getting the approval of the protocol, getting the language decoding, that's not the right word, language challenges of trying to get the protocol done, getting the monitoring requirements in the different organizations, trying to get that aligned is quite challenging and quite, I would say, even expensive for those who fund trials. And so what we've done in the network is actually we don't do international trials anymore. We only work with Health Canada because that was the organization that was the least resistant to sort of the approaches that we needed to do for the trials that we do. So I would just say when we're thinking about how we collaborate, we have to think also not just at the discussion level about the development of the program, but even the implementation of the program, what that takes in order for it to actually come to fruition. Now, for a pharmaceutical company, that may be a different discussion, but for a non-pharmaceutical company or a small company to overcome these hurdles is quite challenging. I just wanted to raise that.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I think it's very important. And I wonder, so from your perspective, when would you recommend to have your organization approach best in the preparation, design, and conduct of pediatric studies? Shall applicants or academics come to you early in the process or once they have the approval from the authorities?
So generally for us, we work very closely with the pediatrics division at the FDA, very closely, so much so that all of our studies have to go through pre-IND discussions before we fully fund that trial. We have to make sure that the FDA has buy-in on the trial design, the outcomes of that trial before we fully go forward with that trial. So when our investigators come to us and we pull together a program, we're already negotiating and thinking about what the outcome of this study is going to be before we even invest any resources in it. And then once we come up with a program that we think is feasible, as I said, we go directly to the FDA, whatever division it is, working alongside with the pediatrics division to really come together to structure that trial and then go back to them after the trial is done.
Great. Since I think Perdita mentioned their, I guess, work with FDA, Dr. Khurana, do you want to comment on it? Because I believe your division might be directly working with NICHD on this cross-agency sort of a collaboration.
We certainly do work very closely with NICHD to identify on a priority list that's compiled by NICHD of off-patent drugs that are in need of pediatric labeling updates. And that's sort of the basis for the package, the pre-IND package that Perdita mentioned. So we serve as liaisons across the different O&D review divisions that sort of have the jurisdiction over the different indication for the drug that's off patent that we're trying to get new labeling for.
Very good. Thank you.
So let's, I think we were discussing extrapolation when we went into this cross-agency discussion. But again, I think being in the review division, Dr. Khurana, do you want to comment on the topic of extrapolation and what is your perspective on it? And,
Sure. I'll say that over the last 20 years since we enacted the U.S. pediatric drug legislation, we really have developed a lot of tools to make pediatric drug development programs more efficient. And I think largely because, and you heard this in earlier sessions, in an attempt to really shorten that lag between the initial adult approval and then subsequent pediatric approval of a product for the same indication. And so pediatric extrapolation has emerged as as a pretty powerful tool for us that we have been routinely trying to apply whenever scientifically justified to streamline pediatric programs by reducing the number and the complexity of clinical trials that might be needed in the pediatric population to support product approval. The acceptability of pediatric extrapolation, I think many of you may know this, but really does hinge on how confident we are about the quality and the amount of evidence to support disease and treatment response similarity between adults and pediatric patients with the disease. And we have moved away from thinking about it as a yes or no question. It really, the extent to which we are able to extrapolate generally falls on a continuum. And it really does depend on how much we know and how much we don't know from all the available data sources. I think an important point I did want to make is that it's tempting to consider pediatric extrapolation when it's challenging or difficult to conduct pediatric trials. We know how challenging, feasibility is a constant concern, but that alone is not a justification to pursue pediatric extrapolation. It really should be scientifically based. And it again hinges on how much we know about the similarity of the disease, the drug pharmacology, and the treatment response between the adult and pediatric populations with the disease.
I just wanted to chime into your original question that you asked me that I did not answer. That was about extrapolation. So for our program, we try our best not to do a study unless we can extrapolate from adult data, because we're doing old drugs and we have the capacity to do studies that impact labeling. So we need the data from adults either to do PK data or safety data or efficacy data. And so we try to do most of our studies via extrapolation from adult data to make it more feasible for us to do those studies. Now, there are times you can extrapolate, like in neonatal diseases, for example. But we do those studies as well if they're necessary. But our goal really is to be able to use the data from adult extrapolation to inform what we do. What we've also seen in some of these older drugs, because we do old drugs, is that sometimes there's no data to extrapolate from. So even though we wanted to go and do a pediatric study in a couple of trials, the data were so old in adults that the FDA didn't even want to use that data. So we even asked to do some PK data in adults because we couldn't extrapolate from such old data in order to do the pediatric studies. So I just wanted to raise that as well.
And thank you. I think you are making a very important point that the quality of data to derive assumptions and prediction must be quite high because it's directly affecting the regulatory decision making.
That's right.
Yeah. And Ralph, I wonder from your perspective.
EMA comments?
Yes, I mean, extrapolation isn't new. We have all in treating patients, we're doing it on a daily basis. And there was then a drive, how could we make use of this? Obviously also in drug development and authorization procedures, we had always implicit extrapolation. And then there was a drive, how could we make it more explicit? And I have to also again mention Cecile in our team when she was at the agency. She was one of the colleagues really, pushing to advance a rather complex way of thinking, and this has continued, and we are now also moving away. So also formally in our PIP template, extrapolation then perhaps came right at the end. If people or if developers or anyone, actually regulators, didn't know what to do, okay, let's consider extrapolation. Now we're turning it a little bit around and putting it more upfront to say, okay, what is actually your concept? What evidence do you see? Do you have? And then to explore what is needed to fill these gaps. And this has to be, really also explicitly written down. So we can then look at the uncertainties and then develop a plan how to fill these gaps. And this is a plan. And then as data emerge, then this plan might have to be updated, or post-authorization might have to be supplemented in the future, potentially by real-world evidence. We looked at PIPs in 2019 to 21, just to see how this is used. So about a quarter, I have to look at my notes now, a quarter of those pediatric investigation programs actually proposed extrapolation. 7% were refused, mainly the disease not being considered to be similar, or due to maturation or developmental differences of the target across populations. 4%, there was an agreement only based on modeling and simulation. And there was only one case where actually extrapolation was proposed between age groups. So that was rather interesting. At that point of time, we didn't have any investigation pediatric programs, including real world data. So it was mainly clinical trials and combined with modeling and simulation.
Great. Thanks so much, Ralph. And now that you mentioned real-world data, real-world evidence, that actually gives me an opportunity, perfect opportunity to transition onto the last topic of the day. That is real-world data evidence, its utility, its advantages, maybe any disadvantages in pediatric drug development, given we all know how challenging it is anyways to do clinical trials in the pediatric population, especially younger children, especially even more so in the neonatal population. So I wanted to ask from each of you about your views, perspectives about usability and utility and advantages, etc., of real-world data, real-world evidence in pediatric drug development, and any perspectives that you might have. So this is a question to all of you. Maybe I can start with Dr. Khurana, and then we'll just go down the line.
I will say that CEDAR does have, I would say, considerable experience with using certain types of real world data to support safety assessments. But CEDAR did launch a real world evidence program following passage of the Cures Act in 2016. And the idea of that program has been to focus on use of real world evidence to support other types of regulatory decision making. I haven't been directly involved with that program. I know the framework is being developed. There have been a number of guidances that have already been published. That group is very actively involved in the IND phase of product development when sponsors are coming in, wanting to rely in part on real world data to support their programs. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Khurana. Sarah, Dr. Zaidi, do you have any comments as well?
So it's not my area of expertise, but within the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, there is some work being done on pediatric use of real-world evidence and real-world data. And I looked at 2 publicly available publications by one of our colleagues, Anne McMahon, and where we're trying to assess what kind of what the scenario is actually right now. So what's the landscape for pediatric real world evidence and real world data? As Mona says, FDA has a lot of experience with looking at that in the post-marketing and in the safety review, like the FAIRS and VAIRS mechanisms. But when you're taking the thought to how can we use this to support an indication or efficacy in taking, a broader approach and not just looking at safety? I think that's an evolving area, not just in pediatrics. So FDA is gaining experience in the same way sponsors are gaining experience with how to take this information and use it. And I think there's a few key concepts. There's a risk of having big holes like missing data that could jeopardize your ability to use real world data, real world evidence. You do want to try to make sure that it's the data you're presenting to be considered as fit for the purpose that you're asking it to be considered for. And you want to, I would say, engage early with your FDA colleagues to see what they think, not your colleagues, I guess, I'm speaking from the point of view if I was a sponsor. So I would want to engage with the relevant FDA review division. And obviously you want to have read through those guidances and have all that information. And I don't know if this is where your question is coming from, but that's where I was thinking it's coming from. So I'm thinking that, you engage early to see what your data set that you think it has to offer, that make sure that your FDA colleagues on the other side who are going to be looking at this, what do they think about it? So you get their input. So I would say if it's an individual basis, like a particular product or drug, it's going to be a case-by-case analysis of what you're proposing. And it's an evolving field. So
Understood. Thank you. Ralph, any comments from your side?
Yes, for sure. There are huge opportunities. So, as we have discussed, randomized controlled trials are often actually against placebo or active, not feasible. And what should we do? We have experience with using, for example, historical controls, and then supplemented by a single-arm trial, and specifically in rare cancer, for example, or NCL2. Then we could imagine, obviously, long-term safety. Randomized controlled trials look at often at a very specific, not very broad part of the population. However, we need to use our medicines across the population. So again, we are extrapolating from results from randomized clinical trials. So here, for sure, data of high quality would be for sure supportive. And what do I mean with high quality? The data need to contain the elements we need to know. They need to contain potentially the gestational age, the family history. They might need to contain certain biomarkers to define a subpopulation. So I've moved to the challenges automatically. Randomized controlled trials might be biased, might be flawed. So as a regulator, we will look into the quality, and here we are also learning of data presented. Insurance-based databases. What about those patients who are not insured? And then as we see in neonatology, if we manage even to collect data, and we have been discussing, GDPR and so on, they still might remain a very small cohort. So, we need to find a way to collect these data in neonatology as you are doing here, and then try to feed them in. So, but we haven't found a solution for this yet. But overall, we have started, looking into the extrapolation a number of years ago. So, and now this is the next step. And for that, we need to be mindful about good quality and how to define this. And again, therefore we are very, very grateful for CPAS and, for this, an organization having this experience and developing such an experience. It gives for sure more reassurance. And another point I would like to mention is we had recently discussions with medicine developers, and whereas for bigger companies it might be a way to explore more easily. Specifically, smaller companies can't even afford to interrogate real world data to create real world evidence. So a lot to do, but we are on it.
Yeah, that reminds me to, discuss with you at a very recent, I guess in the next couple of weeks or whenever I can get a hold of you to discuss how we can perhaps expand our real world data initiatives into Europe also. But yeah, more on that. Perdita, did you want to comment on that? Real world data, real world evidence?
Sure. I'll just give a couple of examples of things we've done at NICHD. So I mentioned earlier how in our program we have used real world data via the Pediatrics with an X database to support our clinical trials. And we've done that with different molecules like ampicillin, acyclovir, caffeine. But we also have another trial design called the Pediatric Opportunistic Study, POPS for short, where it really is a pharmacoepidemiology experiment where we collect clinical data on patients who are on particular drugs via standard of care. So we're not prescribing the drug, they're already on the drug, and we collect PK samples. And when given that sort of opportunistic model, we've been able to collect data on over 150 drugs, over 12,000 patients. And with that model, we've used those samples and that data to actually complement other types of trials that we've done, randomized trials. So that is one way we've used our real world data as well. And I wanted to also say how real world data, of course, can inform your trial design. And our actually neonatal research network has a generic database that is a very large database that they collect a survey of morbidity or mortality data in very low birth weight infants, and have a lot of data that they collect on these patients from admission to discharge, and use that data to develop and design their observational and their randomized trials as well. And so that's another resource that may be available.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, I remember you were mentioning your work with pediatrics, and perhaps something that I should have a discussion with you at a later time about that. Final comment from Agnes. And, Agnes really wanted to hear from you, your and Health Canada's perspective on real world data, real world evidence, and your experience on it and its utility, pros and cons, or about for pediatric drug development.
Okay, so just as I think I sort of could reiterate almost everything that was said here already, in terms of looking at the evidence and how it lines up when we use, first of all, when we want to extrapolate. Real world evidence has been used, I think, in one instance that I know, and it's one oncology drug that was submitted both in the Europe, I think both in Europe FDA and Canada, certainly FDA and Canada, and it was our folks had a real challenge in doing that review because it was the first time that they had encountered this. Although there had been some work done around real world data, this was completely unexpected, and they ended up by using. They applied some what I would call common sense thinking to the entire data package, and the drug was authorized for market because it was an oncology drug, because the disease is relatively rare, because there was nothing else to treat it, because it was also last line treatment for that disease, and because the results really, if you examined individually patient by patient, the outcomes were relatively good, actually quite unexpectedly good. That said, what we do is we have one general guidance that says we are willing to take in data to look at it and to see what the value of it is in various parts of a drug submission. Excuse me. Preferably on the safety side and in the post-market area. And there has been a guidance, the drug that was developed in conjunction with our HTA, that the HTA is going to leverage to try and use real world data and real world evidence to assess reimbursement issues, because there were many of those, and they were very anxious to have something in their hands so that they could actually do a better assessment of reimbursement and of recommending payment, because these HTAs have their own ideas, and you can say yes to a drug, but it may never see the market because, or it never may be reimbursable or a coverable by the healthcare system in one province or another. And so I think they will be utilizing this to do their assessments. Overall, our approach is not much different than what the FDA has outlined, because we need to see the data and the evidence. We did run one little experiment because one of the companies approached us and said, we want to do a bit of an extension of indications. And they were given advice. They designed the study, but the data were not clear enough and strong enough and consistent enough to be able to say yes or no. So they withdrew that submission, that is what we call a supplement. And that was the last time that we had anything submitted to date in terms of using only real world data for a particular focused purpose. So that's where now again, as indicated by my colleague from the FDA and by Sarah Zaidi, there is, we don't, in the pre-market area, we don't deal with that. There is a whole different organization that is in charge of working this up with some input from pre-market, so that if the data becomes strong enough and they're good enough, then we could utilize them. My personal perspective is that real world data, and that's my personal perspective, could be utilized in a way to allow the designing studies in smaller populations when you don't have smaller confirmatory studies, when you cannot have a rigorous clinical trial that is large enough, which you cannot do. And that's where the international studies in pediatrics really can bring significant weight to drug development, particularly for rare diseases and the like.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Agnes. Really appreciate you being us on Zoom for all of that time. I don't want to hold you all from the reception that's waiting outside, but I did want to give an opportunity to the audience to see if anybody had any questions. We're happy to answer that. If none, then I would like to say thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to Agnes, who's been joining us virtually. And thank you for all of you for being here and joining us this meeting. I hope you found the events of the day enjoyable. And tomorrow again, we start, I think, at 9 a.m. The theme of the discussion tomorrow, a lot of it is clinical trial optimization and discussions on cell and gene therapies. So stay tuned for more on that. Thank you so much. And yes, please join us in the atrium for a reception.